The second half of my tour, we were embarked on a flotilla of U.S. Navy ships. I was on the USS Valley Forge, which was a helicopter aircraft carrier that had been a World War II aircraft carrier converted to carry Marine helicopters. Our job was to patrol the northern half of Vietnam, and where we were needed, we were to land in front of the NVA and engage them. In other words, we were not there to patrol particularly as much as we were there to land and fight the North Vietnamese Regular Army. Now, for those of you that know your history, we're coming up on the Tet Offensive. So we're now in December. The Tet Offensive was in early February of 1968. We're now in December. We had landed and fought a few engagements, and we learned very quickly that this was not guerrilla warfare. We were in serious combat with the North Vietnamese Regular Army, one of the best trained armies actually in the world at that time. And so you put the Marine Corps against that, and you're going to have some tough fighting, and that's what happened. In December of 1967, we had had several very successful engagements and defeated the North Vietnamese Army. And so the commanders decided that we were going to land at a little place called Thon Tham Cay. You've never heard of Thon Tham Cay before. Few people have. But I will never forget Christmas Eve of 1967. I attended a church service, and listening to all the snicking and the noises of weapons being prepared because we were landing the next morning, on Christmas morning, to engage in this operation. My job was, I was out of the infantry, so I was in battalion legal. I was still in S3, and I was sort of a D, all of the above person at that time. I had good skills, and a lot of the sections were fighting over my services, mostly because I decided that I was going to do the best job that I could, and that meant getting fought over by some of the section heads. But now, all that aside, we're back to Christmas Eve. The next morning, we launched those operations. The battalion landed on the shore and started advancing into Thon Tham Cay and walked into an ambush. The 804th North Vietnamese Battalion had landed an entire regiment underground, and the company that I was in walked right across the front of that. Lima Company walked across the other front, and they killed the first 2 or 3 squads immediately, including the company commander. In the ensuing battle that happened was a terrible miscommunication between air support. We got no air support. The people on the ground couldn't get naval gunfire because the weather was crappy, and they couldn't land tanks because the weather was too bad. So the net result was we wound up with 48 American Marines killed, and the 4th largest loss of life in a single engagement in Vietnam. My job during that particular period of time scarred me for the rest of my life. I worked on the triage area, and if you don't know what a triage area, that is where you bring the wounded and dead. Decisions are made on the wounded whether they're going to go over there to die, or whether they're going to go over there to be into their hospitals. So my job during that period of time was to put the pieces of the dead back together again, if we could. We literally had pallets of arms, legs, heads that would come in, and we had to match them all together to put them in a body bag. In the case of people that were dying, I went over and helped 6 guys die, just by holding their hand and knowing that somebody was there. And I also went to severely wounded and helped them by being there for them. I never knew how effective that was until 30 or 40 years later. I guess 30 years later, I went to a reunion in Charleston, South Carolina, and 2 or 3 of the guys that had been wounded that day remembered me from being there for them. and that probably was something that was actually something that so heartwarming that I can't even begin to describe it here. The rest of the operation at that time stayed with me for, well, why wouldn't it? That's something horrible that I hope you kids never have to go through in your lifetimes. But at the same time, it gave me a lot of inner strength to cope with things that were going to be bad in my life, because I knew no matter how crappy something got for the rest of my life, there were few things that were ever going to be as horrible as that was. So, now you know why in all those church bulletins around Christmas time you saw a little blurb from me, from Lieutenant Colonel and Mrs. John Davies, in memory of the men of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment who died in Vietnam. That's why, basically, I carry that. That operation ended. We got a lot of replacements. We actually had to go back to the Philippine Islands. We actually had to leave Vietnam because we took so many casualties in that particular group of operations. We went back to the Philippines in January of 1967, and my job got to be a little more humorous at that time. Not only did we have a lot of new people coming in trying to figure out what was going on and get them all settled, but we had people who actually tried to marry prostitutes in Olongapo City. Olongapo City was these people had been in Vietnam for 6 months, and they turned them loose on that town, and they would fall in love with somebody in a couple of hours and expect to marry them. The prostitutes were there trying to get married so they could get the $10,000 in GI benefits if that guy got killed. So it was a real scam job, and I got to help protect them against that kind of stuff. So we went back to Vietnam. We conducted some very serious combat operations for the rest of the time I was there. One of my jobs during that time was to carry a group of ships, small mike boats that carried ammunition and supplies from the base at Qua Vi up to our fire base at Dong Ha. And I would ride those convoys, actually be in charge of them. We would get incoming fire on each of the convoys, but it got to be kind of a joke because they couldn't fire anything into the convoy. You know, so the bullets would all ping on the outside, and we weren't going to put up our, risk getting shot by firing back at them. So the convoys went back and forth, and it got to be almost funny for a while. And then one day, our battalion engaged in, and this is an interesting point, and it goes back to Hawaii. One day I was asked to go back to the infantry because we had an emergency. We were out of people again because of the high casualty rate, and they were going to do a push up the Qua Viet River. And so all of us who were able on the ship were told to prepare to rejoin a line company for that push up the Qua Viet. Well, I was actually on the helicopter with my rifle, all my bandoliers of ammunition, my hand grenades, everything ready to go. And this fat little, we didn't have too many fat people in the Marine Corps, but Corporal Potts was one of them. He came across the flight deck waving a set of orders, and he said, "Corporal Davies, Corporal Davies, Corporal Davies, get off the helicopter." And so I got off the helicopter, and guess where I'm going? I'm going to Hawaii. Why am I going to Hawaii? Because I'm going to testify at a trial for these guys. So I actually got pulled off of a helicopter before I was scheduled to go into battle to catch a plane to go to Hawaii to testify at a trial. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how I got out of Vietnam.